I took this bike completely apart to show you what to grease. Let's get to it. What I'm gonna recommend is like all your small parts and stuff before you just take apart your bike and put it in a bag like I did. I've built these bikes a bunch of times, so I kind of know where everything goes, and there's no real question about what each part is. Keep everything separated, put like down a piece of paper and write down where the location. It might be hard for some people to identify, is this for the spindle or is this for the sprocket? These two pieces might look the same to some people. I don't know. Okay, the first step is have some kind of grease. This is probably not the best kind of grease to be using for this, but that's grease. Some kind of oil. I like this kind of oil because it's really thin and it's made by a company that I relatively trust. This is just a piece of candle wax. This is your rear wheel. There are varying designs, of course, but you want to clean that out right there. And what you're going to want to do, go in your handy dandy bag of parts, pour them all out all at once so you can lose things. And this is going to be your driver, which, like I said, there will be varying designs. This is out of a Mongoose Legion L100 2018. Very cool that it's a 4-pawl design. I really like that, and the pawls are super beefy. Really nice design. Anyway, apply a light coat of oil. And that's what will happen. Okay. So that is step one. There's actually no steps to this. Don't actually pay attention to that. I'm just doing this in random order, but I'm kind of showing you, I'm giving you some guidelines here. You want to have your lock nut on there. These are going to be the parts that you're going to start to grease. You want to grease your axles. So I'm just going to get a little dabber-do here and place it on the axle. And with these nuts, you want the sort of non-smooth surface to be facing up. Now this grease is going to create more or less a seal, so moisture has a harder time getting into your bike, and if it does reach your bike, it'll be somewhat, protected. You don't need that to be super tight. You're going to be taking it on and off all throughout your biking. Next, you just pop your washers on. You can put a little bit of grease your nuts here, and if you have female wheels, just same thing, but just do it on the threads. All this is doing is, like I said, creating that barrier, and a lot of this is going to get displaced anyway, so it doesn't matter if you put like too much on here. This will also help it to where it doesn't seize up. Flip the beast around, pop your thing on, washer on, get a little bit of grease. Now your back wheel is winterized. Front wheel, this one in particular is a female wheel. All we have to do is take a little dab of grease and put it on the threads of the bolt. Lock washer on. Same thing. Pop that grease on them threads. And that's obviously going to be a little more difficult because there's a peg there. Okay, so you get the point. That's that. Fork. First of all, this is the clamping surface. Don't get any oil or grease on there. Obviously, some's going to get on there. But I just like to put a light coat of oil on the steer tube. And this is just to kind of prevent rust. It's not a huge deal if it has a little bit of surface rust. And you can put more in there. You can also put grease on there too. I just prefer oil. A bit of grease on the bearing surface, which is right here. Pretty much any metal to metal surfaces. And this is where the bearing sits, so it's going to be in use quite a bit. Now take your bearings. You can just load this up with grease on the outside. Okay. And then on the inside, pretty much everywhere on the bearing. There's your frame. Then pop that bad boy in. Now take your fork. There you go. Now you've created somewhat of a seal down here. You're going to probably notice a theme here. You grease the top bearing now. Actually, I don't know what this part is called, but it kind of pushes, it centers the bearing, under pressure. Now at this point, you're going to want to get a paper towel and take the grease off the steer tube because we're gonna move on to the next step here. Preferably not one that's already dirty like this. And just take all the grease off the top of the steer tube. Now you're gonna take whatever spacers you run for whatever height you want. This is the spacers I run. Make sure there's no grease on it still. Give it another wiper. Now you can take your bars. Make sure the cable, if you are running one, is oriented the way you like. Slide them bars on. Take whatever top cap or compression cap you're running. This one's just running a cheap sort of a star nut deal. You're gonna put some grease on the threads here. This particular stem, it took me a long time to get these stem bolts lined up, so I'm not gonna take them off. But normally you'd wanna grease your bolts and wipe them down. I actually do have grease on my clamping bolts here and my clamping bolts on the top here. You do wanna grease your bolts. You do not wanna grease the surface that the bars are being clamped onto. So, but you do want to grease all your bolts. You know, just keep that in mind. At this point, you can tighten this up and get your bars straight, but we're not going to do that for the sake of time. So now we're going to take our seat and our seat post, and we're going to apply some grease. Now this, depending on how high you run your seat post, just grease whatever's going to be hidden in your tube. So I know this looks kind of disgusting, what I'm doing here, but I'm just greasing the entire thing because it's all getting put right here. So now we're going to take our bottom bracket bearings, just grease the outer ring and then the inner ring where the spindle sits or the axle of your cranks. And you can put the rest on the sides if you want, that doesn't matter. Make sure and put your spacer in. We're going to also grease the inside and the outside of the spacer. And this is not a huge deal, but this will make it to where this part will be less likely to rust. Pop your spacer in there, and most frames it will not be this easy to pop the bearing in, but this one is a relatively cheap frame. You do want to grease your pedal axles, but I'm not going to do that for the sake of this video. But take your pedals off, grease the threads, the axle itself, the entire thing, where the bearing sits. We're not going to be installing the sprocket or the chain because I'm actually waiting for those parts to arrive in the mail. I bent my sprocket, and the chain, there's no point in putting the chain on if you don't have the sprocket. But yeah, so you want to definitely get in between here, between these grooves and stuff, and just get it all over, right? And slide that in. You do want to, put the spacers on and stuff, but I'm not really going to show you that because I don't know how many spacers you need for your setup. We're just going to pop them on just for looks. Take the inside of your crank arms and grease it up. Like I said, just for visual representation here. Another thing you'd want to address is like your pinch bolts and stuff. With the pinch bolts, I recommend putting thread locker on the ends of them. The end bolts too, I don't know what they're called, but the bolts that go on the center here. I'd recommend thread locker so they just don't come loose while you're riding. If you run brakes, take your U-brake arms off and grease the actual surface that they pivot on. But we're gonna make sure that there's a lot of grease where it's needed, especially for the winter time. For the summertime, and if you live in like a low humidity area, it's not super important to have like tons of grease on your bike at all times. But for the winter, or if you're in a high humidity area, grease the hell out of your bike, especially in parts where dirt's not going to really get there anyway. So it doesn't matter how much grease is there, and it's not like you're going to get weighed down by grease unless you have like the entire tub like filling your tubes or something. At this point, you're really actually good to go. You pop your wheels on, you're all greased up. Just tighten everything up to your specifications. As you can see, this bike is not complete, without the sprocket and whatnot. But just for, your satisfaction, there's the bike. It's kind of complete. I could roll around on it. Things are not tightened up as they should be. But anyway, have a good day. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in a future video.